Welcome to the Social Side Notes podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Tracy Timberlake. Let's dive in. So in this episode, I am going to talk about 8 lessons that entrepreneurs can learn from Game of Thrones. Now, if you are not a Game of Thrones fan and you do not watch the Game of Thrones, that is okay. You can still take these lessons. They're very applicable and universal, whether you watch the show or not. And I'm going to do my best to give examples about these lessons so that you can take them, utilize them, use them for inspiration, motivation, apply them to your life, your business, and all of that. But if you are a Game of Thrones fan, then you know exactly what I mean when I talk about these stories. I have been a fan of Game of Thrones for a very long time. Now, I was a little bit late to the party. I didn't start watching Game of Thrones until season 5. But when I did, I was immediately hooked, as I know many of you were. And I've seen every single episode at least 3 times, even the current ones, because, you know, you can't just watch it one time. Like, there are so many nuggets that you can pick out of each episode. You kind of have to go back and listen to it or watch it several times afterwards just to make sure that you're catching all of the secret Easter eggs that they're putting in there. But as I've watched all the seasons, I've taken notes. I've taken notes on how people handle situations. I've made observations. And in my latest Instagram post, one of my recent ones, I talked about learning from observation. So this is a social side note to that Instagram post. If you want to go and check it out, then please be sure to do so. It's the picture where I'm like sitting on like a concrete bench kind of thing. And I talk about learning from observation. So that's what we're going to do. We are going to learn from observation through the life and experiences of the people in Westeros. So let's go ahead and get started with number 1. If you want to go ahead and grab a pen and paper, this is probably the time to do that. So I'll give you a couple of seconds. Or, of course, because this is a podcast, you can always pause it, rewind it, come back and listen to it. But if you're a Game of Thrones fan, I think you'll get a kick out of these lessons that I've been able to pull out. And of course, there are probably an infinite number. This is not a comprehensive list of all of the lessons you can learn from A Song of Ice and Fire or from the world of Game of Thrones. But these are the 8 that I immediately think about. Okay, so number 1 is do not despise humble beginnings. So when Game of Thrones was first picked up by HBO, they filmed an original pilot episode. Apparently, it was awful. They said it was bad, like real bad, Michael Jackson bad. And they were wondering whether or not the show was going to work because the pilot was just awful. But HBO did see the potential in what the show could bring because the books are just so intricate and brilliantly written that they were like, okay, we have to at least try. So what they did is they went with it anyway. They recast some of the people. I don't know if you know this, but they recast Daenerys. They recast Lady Stark were among them and a few other people, and then reshot several of the scenes. Mind you, the first pilot took millions of dollars to shoot. I mean, it is not a cheap show. We know that now. I think HBO is operating with a budget of like $12 to $15 million per episode. Now, this was a pilot, so they didn't have all the CGI stuff yet, but it's still not a cheap thing to shoot an entire pilot. You have an entire crew, actors to pay, editing, post-production, all that stuff. So it wasn't a cheap thing to do, but instead of crying about a lost investment, they just did it again. Right? Determined to make it work. I don't think any of them realized where the show was going to take them. And here we are 10 years later, and it's this cultural phenomenon. Even if you don't watch Game of Thrones, I would take time to study it on that principle alone. Just understanding not to despise humble beginnings, because Game of Thrones was a show of a whole bunch of no-name actors, essentially, right? Aside from like Sean Bean. And it was a book that did really well, but they didn't know how it was going to translate, right? And the first pilot was terrible. So where you start doesn't have to be where you end up, but you got to make moves. You got to push forward, recast some roles in your life, in your business, reshoot some scenes, do some things over, and that has to be okay, right? Okay, on to lesson number 2. which is to believe in your dreams and trust the vision that you've been given. And I say this all the time. I am a firm believer that the dreams you have been given, the vision that you have is divinely inspired, and it is your responsibility to steward it well. There's a quote, I don't know what season it was from, but when Daenerys was in Karth, and she was having a conversation with one of the guys in Karth or whatever, and she was explaining her story and her testimony. And she said, I'm no ordinary woman. My dreams come true. Do you understand? Right? And when she was in the throne room and she met Jon Snow for the first time, she was very clear on one thing. She said, the reason why I got to where I am isn't because I was relying on this, that, or the other. It wasn't even my name. It was because I believed in myself. Daenerys Targaryen is what she said. And success is an inside job for that reason. Like you must do the same. You have to believe that your dreams come true, that you are no ordinary man, you are no ordinary woman, and you got to believe in yourself. So Dany had haters too, right? Heck, she even had assassins try to kill her. Her brother sold her off, pawned her off as a part of his chess game, but she trusted her vision anyway. And she easily could have stayed in exile in Essos. Right? That probably would have been easier than trying to go claim the Iron Throne, getting all of these people to rally behind her, but she didn't. She went for it because she knew she could, she had a vision, and she's doing it anyway. And at the time of this recording, it has only been episode 4 of the final season, so we don't even know who's going to win, the Game of Thrones. We don't know who's going to sit on the Iron Throne, but if Daenerys doesn't sit there, it's not for a lack of trying, because she certainly gave it her all. The third thing I would say is to keep good counsel. Even Daenerys Targaryen, mother of dragons, had an inner circle of advisors and counselors, what we would call maybe coaches or mentors in this day and age. She made sure to get coaching and advice from people that knew more than her in different areas. They can see gaps that she couldn't, right? She's never been to war. She's never had to rally up an entire army to fight all these people. So instead, she solicited some advice from people who knew a little bit more than her in that regard. So can you imagine her trying to take back?